My daughter had real estate agents touring my home while I was still living in it. But here's what she didn't know. I had been quietly preparing for this moment for months. While she thought she was managing my life, I was preparing to reassert my own path. Today, I'll walk you through exactly how I turned her manipulation into my liberation, using 3 strategic moves that any woman facing family betrayal can apply. The first move involves keys, the second involves documentation, and the third will surprise you. But before I share those strategies, I need you to understand how it began, with the sound of my own front door becoming something I no longer recognized. The first strangers entered at 10:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reading the newspaper with my morning coffee, when I heard voices in my front hallway. Not my daughter's voice alone, but strangers discussing room dimensions and natural lighting as if I weren't there. The first time real estate agents walked through my living room while I sat in my kitchen, I felt something shift inside me that I couldn't name. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger would come later. It was more like the sensation of watching yourself disappear while everyone around you continues their conversation. My hands trembled as I held my coffee cup, listening to footsteps move through spaces I had inhabited for 37 years. My daughter had scheduled these tours without telling me, speaking about my home as if I were already gone, as if my presence was just an inconvenience to be managed. Her voice carried that professional tone I had never heard her use before, crisp, efficient, completely divorced from any acknowledgement that this was still my sanctuary. She guided them past the kitchen doorway without even glancing in my direction, as though I had already faded into the wall pall. For I watched these strangers evaluate my life, pointing at my furniture, discussing my garden, calculating square footage while I existed as a ghost in my own space. One agent scrutinized my bedroom closet, commenting on storage capacity while my personal belongings served as nothing more than props in their assessment. Another tested the water pressure in my bathroom sink, turning faucets on and off with the casual authority of someone inspecting a vacant property. The woman with the clipboard walked through my living room, noting the condition of my hardwood floors while stepping around the ottoman where I rested my feet every evening. She photographed my kitchen from multiple angles, capturing my coffee maker, my dish towels, my small collection of cookbooks as background details in what she called the staging potential of the space. The agents would glance at me with that practiced smile, the one that says, "We'll pretend this isn't awkward if you will." Their eyes would slide over me and away, as if making direct contact might somehow complicate the business at hand. I represented a logistical challenge to be managed, rather than a person whose consent might be relevant to the proceedings. Despite the external violation, my mind remained clear, observing, taking in every detail. My daughter would guide them through each room, her voice bright and businesslike, explaining away my belongings as easily cleared out. She discussed my furniture as temporary obstacles, my personal photographs as clutter to be removed, my lifetime of accumulated memories as items that would need to be dealt with before closing. When they reached my sewing room, she described it as having excellent potential as a home office, once it was cleaned up. The most chilling moment came when they discussed timeline in my own hallway. The lead agent asked about occupancy issues, and my daughter assured her that the transition would be smooth because I was very cooperative and understood the necessity of the move. I had never agreed to any move, never been consulted about any timeline, never expressed any understanding about any necessity. In that moment, I understood that help and control often wear the same face, and the difference lies in who holds the keys. What I had interpreted as my daughter's concern for my welfare revealed itself as something far more calculated. She wasn't protecting me from the burden of difficult decisions. She was making those decisions without me, then presenting them as inevitable outcomes I was expected to accept. Like a tree whose roots have been secretly severed while its branches still appear healthy, I looked intact from the outside while my foundation had been systematically undermined. The agents saw an elderly woman sitting peacefully in her kitchen, not recognizing that they were witnessing the dissolution of someone's entire world without her consent. This realization became the foundation for everything that followed, the quiet rebellion that would change both our lives. Something crystallized in that kitchen chair as I listened to strangers plan my future. The vulnerability I had been feeling transformed into something sharper and more focused. I recognized that I still possessed capabilities my daughter had chosen to ignore, still retained decision-making abilities she had elected to bypass. The tour lasted 47 minutes. I counted each one, watching the second hand sweep around the clock face above my refrigerator while my life was dissected and evaluated by people who had never asked my permission to enter. When they finally left, my daughter didn't return to, explain or apologize. She simply locked the door behind them and drove away, leaving me alone with the knowledge that this had not been a one-time occurrence. I learned that recognizing when family help crosses into control starts with trusting that sick feeling in your stomach when your own home stops feeling like yours. The nausea I had been experiencing for weeks suddenly made perfect sense. My body had been alerting me to a danger my mind hadn't yet been willing to acknowledge. But recognition was only the first step in a much longer game I was about to learn to play. As I sat in my kitchen that afternoon, surrounded by the silence left behind by unwelcome visitors, I began to understand that my daughter had made a crucial miscalculation. She had assumed that age equals helplessness, that cooperation signifies consent, and that control could be maintained indefinitely without resistance. What I didn't yet realize was how long she had been orchestrating this moment, how carefully she had been building the case for my incompetence through months of seemingly loving gestures. The theater of caring concern had been running for months, and I had been her willing audience for every performance. Looking back now, I can see how masterfully she orchestrated every gesture, every offer of assistance, every expression of concern. What I mistook for devotion was actually the careful construction of a cage built from kindness, designed to make me grateful for my own captivity. She would arrive with groceries I didn't need, rearrange my medications for my safety, and gradually insert herself into every corner of my daily routine. The groceries came with lectures about proper nutrition and subtle criticisms of my food choices. She would reorganize my pantry while explaining how confused I seemed about expiration dates, replacing perfectly good items with her preferred brands. My medication routine, which I had managed independently for years, suddenly required her supervision and a new pill organizer system that only she understood. Each morning brought a phone call to confirm I had taken my pills correctly. Each evening brought another call to review what I had eaten and whether I had followed her instructions. My daily schedule gradually shifted to accommodate her availability, her concerns, her assessment of what was appropriate for someone my age. I found myself asking permission for activities I had done independently for decades. The caring gestures came with invisible strings attached, each act of help creating a debt I was expected to repay with compliance. When I expressed appreciation for her assistance, she would remind me how much time she was sacrificing, how worried she was about my welfare, how difficult it was to manage her own life while caring for mine. The message was clear. My gratitude should translate into cooperation with whatever arrangements she deemed necessary. Her questions became more probing, more frequent, more judgmental. Phone calls became interrogations disguised as check-ins. Did you remember to take your pills? Did you eat the soup I brought? Why didn't you answer when I called at noon? Each question carried an undertone of accusation, as if my normal daily variations were evidence of declining competence rather than ordinary human behavior. When I mentioned feeling tired, she interpreted it as confusion. When I forgot a minor detail, she treated it as memory loss. When I chose to spend an afternoon reading instead of doing housework, she saw it as depression or withdrawal. My normal responses to life's daily fluctuations were being cataloged as symptoms of incompetence, creating a medical narrative that existed only in her interpretation of my behavior. She began speaking about me in the third person when others were present, as if my capacity to speak for myself had somehow evaporated overnight. During family gatherings, she would answer questions directed to me, explaining my thoughts and feelings to relatives who had asked me directly. She would correct my stories, claiming I had confused details or forgotten important facts, even when my memory was accurate and complete. The most disturbing shift came when she started positioning herself as the interpreter of my needs and desires. She would tell visitors that I was tired when I felt energetic, that I preferred quiet when I wanted conversation, that I needed rest when I wanted activity. My own voice in my own home was being systematically replaced by her version of what I should be thinking and feeling. I started noticing how she positioned herself between me and other family members, filtering conversations and controlling information flow. When my sister called, my daughter would often answer and provide lengthy updates about my condition before handing me the phone. When neighbors stopped by, she would greet them at the door and explain why visits should be brief or postponed entirely. My social connections were being managed through her assessment of what was appropriate or beneficial. Friends became less frequent callers as my daughter took to screening them, explaining that I was having a difficult day or wasn't up for conversation. Several people had stopped reaching out because they believed I know low. Anger wanted contact when in reality I had never received their messages or invitations. The real estate agents weren't the beginning of her plan. They were the culmination of months of carefully constructed narrative that I was no longer capable of managing my own life. Every small intervention, every helpful gesture, every expression of concern had been building toward this moment when she could present herself as the responsible adult making difficult but necessary decisions for an incompetent parent. The most chilling moment came when I overheard her on the phone, discussing my condition with someone, describing symptoms I didn't have and limitations I hadn't expressed. She spoke about memory problems I hadn't experienced, confusion I hadn't displayed, and physical limitations that didn't exist. She was creating a medical profile that justified her interventions and supported her narrative of my declining capacity. As I listened to her describe a version of me that bore no resemblance to my actual experience, I felt a cold clarity settle over my understanding of what had been happening. She wasn't responding to my decline. She was creating the evidence for it. Every natural variation in my energy or mood was being documented as proof of incompetence. Every normal sign of aging was being presented as dangerous deterioration. I discovered that manipulative family members often create the very incompetence they claim to be solving, turning your natural aging process into evidence of your inability to function. Like a gardener who waters a plant so excessively that its roots begin to rot, then points to the wilting leaves as proof that the plant cannot survive without constant attention, she had created the problems she claimed to be addressing. This insight helped me understand that my growing confusion wasn't about my declining abilities. It was about her increasing interference. The uncertainty I had been feeling wasn't cognitive decline. It was a natural response of a competent person being treated as incompetent, constantly second-guessed and overruled in decisions about her own life. But there was something else happening beneath all this manufactured concern, something I hadn't yet recognized. Her conversations were shifting in ways that had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with calculations I was only beginning to understand. The moment I understood that my home had become my daughter's retirement plan, everything clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The pieces of the puzzle I had been trying to ignore suddenly formed a picture I could no longer pretend not to see. This wasn't about my welfare or my safety or my declining abilities. This was about equity and market value and financial planning that had nothing to do with my actual needs or desires. I began paying attention to the conversations she had when she thought I wasn't listening, the way she spoke about property values and market timing. Standing in my hallway, I could hear her phone calls through the thin walls of my bedroom. She discussed comparable sales in the neighborhood with the casual expertise of someone who had been researching the market for months. She knew which houses had sold recently, what they had sold for, and how my property compared in terms of size and condition. Her conversations revealed a level of preparation that stunned me. What kind of daughter plans so thoroughly without her mother's knowledge or consent? She had been tracking interest rates, monitoring seasonal patterns in the local real estate market, and calculating optimal timing for a sale. These weren't the casual inquiries of someone exploring possibilities. These were the detailed investigations of someone executing a predetermined plan. She wasn't helping me plan for my future. She was planning her future using my assets, and my continued presence in my own home was becoming inconvenient to her timeline. Every conversation about my housing situation was actually a conversation about her financial situation. Every expression of concern about my ability to maintain the property was really an assessment of how quickly she could convert it to cash. The language she used when discussing my living arrangements shifted in ways I hadn't initially recognized, but now found impossible to ignore. She stopped asking what I wanted and started explaining what made sense. She stopped discussing options and started presenting conclusions. The financial conversations shifted from what's best for you to what makes the most sense, language that prioritized efficiency over my actual desires. When she brought up alternative living arrangements, she framed them entirely in terms of practical benefits rather than my preferences. She would explain how much simpler my life would be without the burden of property maintenance, how much safer I would be with professional staff available around the clock, how much more social interaction I would have with other residents. She never asked whether I wanted simplicity, professional supervision, or increased social interaction. The real estate tours weren't exploratory. They were part of an active strategy to establish market value and generate interest before I had agreed to sell. The agents who walked through my home weren't there to help me understand my options. They were there to help her understand the potential return on her investment in my care and the timeline required to maximize that return. I realized she had been cultivating relationships with agents, possibly even signing preliminary agreements or authorizations using my supposed incapacity as justification. The familiarity between my daughter and the real estate professionals suggested ongoing communication that extended far beyond the brief tours I had witnessed. They spoke with the comfortable shorthand of people who had been working together on this project for some time. She began bringing up assisted living facilities with increasing frequency, armed with brochures and statistics about safety, as if my current life was inherently dangerous. The facilities she researched were all within reasonable driving distance of her own home, but none were in neighborhoods where I had established relationships or familiar routines. The selection criteria centered entirely on her convenience and my affordability, with no consideration of my preferences or attachments. The brochures she presented focused exclusively on risk reduction and medical supervision, painting a picture of my current independence as a series of potential disasters waiting to happen. She compiled statistics about falls, medication errors, and social isolation among elderly people living alone, as if these general population risks applied specifically and inevitably to my situation. Like a business consultant presenting a case for organizational restructuring, she had assembled her arguments with professional thoroughness and emotional detachment. The data she presented was accurate but selectively chosen to support her predetermined conclusion. The options she offered were real, but carefully curated to make her preferred choice appear inevitable. The most revealing moment came when she mentioned that she had already researched the legal process for assuming power of attorney when the time comes. This wasn't a contingency plan for some future crisis. This was preparation for a transition she intended to orchestrate. She had investigated the documentation required, the medical evaluations needed, and the legal procedures necessary to assume control of my financial affairs. Her research into power of attorney wasn't motivated by concern about my future incapacity. It was motivated by impatience with my current competence, which remained an obstacle to her plans. She needed legal authority to proceed with the sale of my property and the management of my assets, and she had identified the pathway to obtain that authority regardless of my cooperation or consent. I learned that when family members start treating your home as their asset to manage, they've already crossed the line from care into exploitation. The shift from daughter to financial planner had happened gradually, disguised as increasing concern for my welfare. But the underlying motivation had always been the conversion of my assets into her security. This realization became the catalyst for my decision to start documenting everything, because I knew I would need evidence of what was really happening. Her careful planning and systematic approach meant that my resistance would require equal preparation and strategic thinking to be effective. But documentation was only the beginning. What I hadn't yet recognized was how completely she had already begun transforming my daily existence, turning my own sanctuary into something I barely recognized. My daily routines became performances under constant evaluation. The most insidious prison is the one constructed from gestures of love, because it makes you question whether you're ungrateful for wanting to escape. When someone builds walls around your life using kindness as mortar, resistance feels like betrayal, and objection sounds like ingratitude. I began to understand this as my living space gradually transformed from my sanctuary into a carefully monitored environment where every choice was filtered through my daughter's approval. The changes started small and reasonable. She suggested updating my front door lock because the old one sometimes stuck. The locksmith she called installed a sophisticated system with multiple deadbolts and security features I had never requested. When I asked for copies of all the keys, she assured me she would have them made but somehow never found the time. I found myself dependent on her schedule for basic access to my own property, waiting for her arrival when I locked myself out after checking the mail. The back door received the same treatment, along with new window locks that required special tools to operate. Each security improvement reduced my independence while supposedly enhancing my safety. I began to feel like a tenant in my own home, requiring permission and assistance to enter and exit spaces I had navigated freely for decades. My phone line was switched to a plan that allowed her to monitor my calls in case of emergency, effectively ending my privacy and controlling my connections to the outside world. She explained that the new system would help her respond quickly if I needed assistance, and would provide detailed records of my communication patterns that could be useful if I ever required medical evaluation. The monthly bill now included a detailed log of every number I called and every number that called me, complete with duration and frequency analysis. Incoming calls began to go through her screening process. Friends who tried to reach me would first speak with her about the purpose of their call and whether it was an appropriate time for conversation. She would determine whether I was having a good day or feeling too tired for social interaction, often ending conversations before I knew they had begun. My connection to the outside world gradually narrowed to the relationships she deemed beneficial and the conversations she considered appropriate. Simple activities like gardening or walking to the mailbox became subjects for discussion and concern. My world shrank to spaces she deemed safe. My morning routine of watering plants on the front porch required her approval based on weather conditions, my energy level, and the appropriateness of my clothing choices. She worried about me bending over to tend flower beds, concerned about falls or overexertion that could result in injury. The mailbox, located at the end of my driveway, became a source of particular anxiety for her. She worried about my stability on the slight incline, the possibility of encountering aggressive dogs from neighboring properties, and my ability to safely navigate return trips while carrying mail. These reasonable-sounding concerns gradually eliminated activities that had previously given me pleasure and purpose. They replaced them with supervised alternatives she considered more suitable. Friends who used to visit regularly began declining invitations after encounters with my daughter's intensive questioning about their intentions and the appropriateness of their visits. She would greet visitors at the door with detailed inquiries about the purpose of their visit, the length of time they planned to stay, and whether they had any concerns about my health or behavior. These interactions, presented as protective screening, created an atmosphere of suspicion and discomfort that discouraged casual social contact. My weekly bridge group, which had met at my home for 15 years, relocated to another member's house after my daughter's repeated suggestions that hosting was becoming too stressful for me. She worried about my ability to prepare adequate refreshments, maintain appropriate conversation, and clean up afterwards without becoming overly fatigued. The group eventually stopped including me in their rotation entirely, convinced that participation was more burden than pleasure. The kitchen, once my domain, became her command center where she organized my medications, planned my meals, and conducted her business calls about my future. She installed new storage systems for my prescription bottles, creating elaborate schedules and reminder systems that replaced my simple routine of taking pills with breakfast and dinner. My refrigerator was restocked according to her nutritional assessments rather than my food preferences, filled with items chosen for their health benefits rather than my enjoyment. Her business calls took place at my kitchen table while I was relegated to the living room, listening to conversations about my life conducted without my participation. She scheduled appointments with doctors I had never met, arranged consultations with financial advisors I had never requested, and coordinated services I had never wanted. My kitchen table became the headquarters for managing my life while I was excluded from the decision-making process. Even my mail was redirected through her for convenience, ensuring that any financial or legal communications passed through her hands before reaching mine. Important documents were opened and filed according to her organizational system. Bills were reviewed and paid through her assessment of their validity and priority. Personal correspondence was sorted based on her judgment about whether the content was appropriate or potentially upsetting for someone in my condition. Like a gardener who gradually transplants a healthy tree into an increasingly smaller pot, claiming each reduction in space is for the plant's own protection, she had systematically constrained every aspect of my independence while presenting each limitation as an act of love. The pot was becoming too small for healthy growth, but I was expected to be grateful for the careful tending that won. As slowly killing my roots, I discovered that when your own living space becomes a cage, the bars are often built from someone else's definition of what's good for you. This understanding helped me recognize that my growing sense of suffocation wasn't paranoia. It was my instinct correctly identifying that my freedom was disappearing, one helpful gesture at a time. But the physical constraints were only part of what was happening to me. The psychological pressure of living under constant surveillance was creating something far more damaging than restricted movement. Every morning brought fresh scrutiny, and I felt the bone-deep weariness of living under a microscope. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being constantly observed in your own home, where every action is evaluated for signs of decline or incompetence. Every gesture carries weight it was never meant to bear. Every choice becomes a test you didn't know you were taking. I began to feel like a patient in my own life, with my daughter serving as both doctor and judge, constantly assessing my fitness for independence. Her presence in my home shifted from visits to surveillance, her attention from affection to analysis. She would arrive each morning with coffee and conversation, but her eyes tracked my movements with clinical precision. How steady was my walk to the kitchen? Did I remember where I placed my reading glasses? Was my response time slower than yesterday when she asked about my medication schedule? The weight of her scrutiny made me second-guess my own capabilities, creating the very confusion and hesitation she pointed to as evidence of my declining mental state. Her expectation of my failure became a gravitational force, pulling my confidence down into uncertainty and my natural competence into manufactured doubt. Like a performer who becomes self-conscious under harsh stage lights, I began to stumble over acting and songs I had performed effortlessly for decades. Simple tasks suddenly felt complicated under her watchful gaze. Making breakfast required conscious thought about each step, not because the process had become difficult, but because I knew she was cataloging any deviation from her concept of proper procedure. Opening mail became an exercise in performance anxiety, with her watching me sort through envelopes, noting any hesitation as cognitive delay. The garden, once my refuge, became another testing ground where she monitored how long I spent outside and whether I showed signs of overexertion. The internal monologue became a constant calculation. If I do this, will she use it as evidence that I can't take care of myself? If I don't do this, will she see it as proof that I'm giving up? Every choice carried potential consequences that extended far beyond the immediate decision. This mental chess game consumed enormous amounts of energy that should have been directed towards simply living my life. Instead of experiencing my days, I was managing her interpretation of my days. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake weighing the cost of resistance against the price of compliance, knowing that both choices led to further loss of autonomy. The night hours stretched endlessly as I replayed conversations and interactions, analyzing what I had done well and where I might have provided evidence for her growing case about my declining capabilities. Each day's performance was reviewed and critiqued in the darkness, preparing for tomorrow's continued observation. The bedroom, my final sanctuary, offered no real rest. Even there, I felt the weight of her attention extending through the walls. Had I taken my medication at the right time? Would she notice if I got up during the night? Was my sleep pattern being monitored and recorded as another data point in her assessment of my overall condition? The most painful realization was that I had begun to doubt my own perceptions, wondering if perhaps she was right, and I really was becoming the incompetent person she described. Under the pressure of constant questioning, my confidence in my own observations and abilities began to erode. Maybe I was more confused than I realized. Maybe my memory was worse than I thought. Maybe her concerns were justified, and my resistance was simply evidence of the very decline she was trying to address. This internal doubt was perhaps her most effective tool. By making me question my own competence, she eliminated the possibility of confident self-advocacy. A person who doubts her own perceptions cannot effectively argue for her own autonomy. A person who questions her own capabilities cannot convincingly demonstrate her continued independence. I learned that the psychological toll of coercive control lies not just in what's taken from you, but in how it makes you question your own capacity to know what's being taken. This insight became the turning point where I decided that regardless of my age or limitations, my ability to think strategically remained intact and would become my greatest weapon. But strategic thinking required information, and information required opportunities that seemed increasingly rare in my carefully monitored existence. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, and that understanding would require a kind of courage I hadn't accessed in years. The opportunity would come sooner than I expected, in the most ordinary of moments. Her jacket hung on my kitchen chair like an invitation I couldn't ignore. The moment I slipped my fingers into my daughter's coat pocket and felt those keys, I understood that freedom often begins with the smallest act of quiet rebellion. The metal was warm from her body heat, the weight heavier than I expected, and 7 keys strung together on a ring I had never seen before, each one representing a piece of my life that had been quietly removed from my control. Her voice carried through the thin wall between the kitchen and living room, discussing timelines and logistics with someone whose identity I could only guess. This was the same business-like tone she used with the real estate agents, the same detached professionalism that had replaced her natural warmth whenever my future became the topic of conversation. The conversation gave me perhaps 5 minutes of opportunity. 5 minutes to understand what I was really dealing with. 5 minutes to gather intelligence that might prove crucial to whatever resistance I was finally ready to mount. My heart raced as I carefully lifted the keyring, knowing that discovery would mean immediate escalation of her control, but also knowing that I had to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. The risk felt enormous and necessary at the same time. If she caught me going through her belongings, she would have concrete evidence to support her narrative about my declining judgment and inappropriate behavior. But if I didn't take this chance to understand the tools she was using against me, I would remain defenseless against strategies I couldn't even identify. There were 7 keys total. 3 I recognized as belonging to my front door, back door, and windows, but 4 others I had never seen before. Keys to spaces and locks I didn't even know existed. The familiar keys looked different somehow when viewed as instruments of control rather than simple household necessities. These were the keys to my own home. Keys I should have possessed. Keys that had been withheld from me under the guise of security and convenience. The 4 unfamiliar keys puzzled me completely. They were different sizes and shapes, clearly meant for different types of locks. One was small and delicate, possibly for a filing cabinet or desk drawer. Another was thick and substantial, designed for heavy-duty security. The third looked like it might fit a mailbox or storage unit. The 4th was completely foreign to me, its purpose entirely mysterious. Standing there in my own kitchen with stolen moments and borrowed courage, I tried to imagine what these keys unlocked. What spaces in my life had been secured without my knowledge? What documents or belongings had been placed beyond my reach? What preparations had been made that required locks I wasn't supposed to know about? The weight of those keys in my palm represented every choice that had been taken from me, every decision made without my consent, every lock changed without my knowledge. Like holding evidence of a crime I was only beginning to understand, I felt the physical proof of my daughter's systematic removal of my agency. Each key was a small metal monument to my diminishing autonomy. The familiar keys spoke of access denied to my own property. The unfamiliar keys spoke of preparations made in secret, arrangements that required security I wasn't meant to breach. Together, they told a story of control that extended far beyond what I had imagined possible. This wasn't just about monitoring my daily activities or managing my living space. This was about creating an entire infrastructure of containment. I stood there in my own kitchen, holding keys to my own home that I had been denied, understanding for the first time the full architecture of my captivity. Like a prisoner discovering the blueprint of her cell, I finally saw the systematic nature of what had been constructed around me. Every helpful gesture, every security improvement, every convenience, it had been part of a larger design that required keys I was never meant to hold. The urge to pocket those keys was overwhelming. They represented power, access, the possibility of reclaiming spaces that had been taken from me. But I recognized that theft would be discovered quickly and would provide her with the ammunition she needed to accelerate whatever timeline she was following. My moment of advantage would become her opportunity to demonstrate my incompetence and justify increased restrictions. The act of returning those keys to her pocket without taking them was perhaps the most strategic decision I had ever made. It gave me knowledge without revealing my awareness. Like a spy who photographs documents rather than stealing them, I preserved my cover while gathering intelligence. She would never know that I had discovered the full scope of her preparations, which meant she would continue operating under the assumption that I remained ignorant and passive. In that moment, I shifted from being a victim of circumstance to being an active participant in my own liberation, even if she would never know it. The transformation was internal but complete. I was no longer someone things were being done to. I was someone who was choosing how to respond. The difference felt revolutionary. I discovered that reclaiming agency doesn't always require dramatic gestures. Sometimes it begins with simply understanding the true nature of what has been taken from you. This quiet act of reconnaissance became the foundation for everything that followed, because you cannot strategically reclaim what you do not fully understand has been lost. But understanding the scope of my captivity was only the first step. I needed allies, people who could see me as I truly was rather than as my daughter had portrayed me. The problem was that she had spent months ensuring that such people no longer existed in my world. Rebuilding those connections required courage I hadn't accessed in years. The most dangerous thing to a controller is when their victim begins to rebuild connections to the world they've been systematically cut off from. Like a gardener who discovers that someone has been secretly cutting the roots of her prize roses while she slept, I began to understand that my growing isolation hadn't been natural decline, but deliberate sabotage. The loneliness I had attributed to aging was actually the result of careful interference designed to make me dependent on my daughter's version of reality. I realized that my isolation hadn't happened overnight. It had been carefully orchestrated through a series of small discouragements and manufactured inconveniences that made reaching out feel impossible. Phone calls became complicated when my daughter installed the monitoring system that required her approval for long-distance charges. Visits became awkward when she positioned herself as the gatekeeper who determined whether I was having a good day or feeling too tired for company. Social invitations dried up after months of her explanations about my declining health and increasing need for rest. The process had been so gradual that I hadn't recognized it as deliberate isolation. Friends stopped calling because they believed I preferred solitude. Neighbors stopped dropping by because they thought I found visitors overwhelming. Family members reduced their contact because my daughter had convinced them that too much stimulation was harmful to my condition. Each severed connection had been justified as protection for my well-being. My daughter had positioned herself as my primary contact with the outside world, filtering all communications and relationships through her assessment of what was appropriate or necessary. She became the interpreter of my needs to others and the interpreter of others' intentions to me. Every relationship in my life passed through her evaluation and editing. Every piece of information from the outside world came pre-processed through her concerns and recommendations. This positioning gave her enormous power over my reality. She could present herself as the devoted daughter managing a difficult situation while simultaneously controlling every narrative about my capabilities and needs. To the outside world, she appeared selflessly dedicated. To me, she became the sole authority on what was safe, appropriate, and beneficial for someone in my condition. I began to understand that her constant presence wasn't protection. It was prevention, designed to keep me from accessing the support systems that might question her version of my story. like a security guard who claims to be protecting valuable artwork while actually preventing anyone from examining it closely enough to recognize forgeries. She was shielding me from the very people who might notice that her portrait of my decline didn't match the reality of my continued competence. The breakthrough came when I remembered an old friend who had stopped calling after my daughter had told her I was not up for visitors during a period when I had been desperately lonely. Margaret had been my closest friend for over 20 years, someone who understood my sense of humor and respected my intelligence. Her sudden absence from my life had been explained as natural drift, the inevitable result of aging and changing interests. But I remembered the timing differently now. Margaret had stopped calling during the exact period when my daughter's involvement in my daily life was increasing most dramatically. The connection had been severed just when I most needed a perspective outside my daughter's influence. This hadn't been coincidence or natural evolution. This had been strategic elimination of a potential threat to my daughter's growing control. I started making small, strategic contacts during the brief windows when my daughter was away, carefully rebuilding relationships that had been allowed to wither. The courage required for these actions surprised me. Each phone call felt like an act of rebellion, each conversation a risk that could be discovered and used as evidence of my poor judgment. But I recognized that the planning and timing required for these reconnections proved my mental capabilities remained sharp, contradicting everything my daughter claimed about my declining state. The first call to Margaret revealed everything I needed to know about how my isolation had been manufactured. She had tried to maintain contact but had been repeatedly told that I wasn't available, wasn't feeling well, or wasn't interested in socializing. She had eventually stopped trying because she believed I no longer wanted her friendship. Each conversation revealed how much my isolation had been artificially maintained. Friends thought I no longer wanted contact because my daughter had told them I found phone calls exhausting. Neighbors believed I preferred solitude because she had explained that social interaction overstimulated my fragile condition. Family members had been told I was too fragile for normal interaction, that visits should be brief and infrequent to avoid overwhelming me. The pattern was consistent across every relationship. My daughter had positioned herself as the protective buffer between me and a world that was supposedly too demanding for my declining capabilities. She had created a narrative of my fragility that justified increasingly restrictive management of my social connections. People who cared about me had been convinced that respecting my limitations meant staying away. The most powerful moment came when I realized that people were willing to help, but they needed to know help was wanted and welcomed. Margaret's immediate response to my call proved that the affection and concern of longtime friends hadn't disappeared. It had simply been misdirected by misinformation about my desires and capabilities. The support network I thought I had lost was actually still there, waiting for permission to reconnect. I learned that breaking free from coercive control requires rebuilding the external connections that validate your reality and provide alternative perspectives on your situation. These renewed relationships became my lifeline to a world where I was still seen as a capable person deserving of respect and autonomy. But rebuilding connections was only part of what I needed to do. I was beginning to understand that my word against hers would never be enough, especially when she had spent months building a case for my incompetence. I needed something more concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed or reinterpreted through the lens of my supposed decline. That evidence became my shield against a reality I could no longer trust to remain stable. I learned that when someone is rewriting your story, your survival depends on keeping your own record of what's actually happening. The realization struck me during one of my daughter's phone calls when I heard her describe events that bore no resemblance to what I had witnessed. She spoke about my confusion during a doctor's appointment where I had been completely lucid, mentioned falls that had never occurred, and described medication errors I had never made. In that moment, I understood that my memory wasn't failing, but someone was actively working to replace my reality with their version of events. Every conversation, every decision made without my input, every change to my living situation became something I quietly recorded in a small notebook I kept hidden in my bedroom. The notebook itself was unremarkable, a simple spiral-bound pad I had found in my kitchen drawer, but its contents became my lifeline to sanity. I wrote down dates, times, exact quotes when possible, and detailed descriptions of events as they actually occurred, rather than as they were later reinterpreted by my daughter. The first entries felt almost silly. Recording normal conversations and routine activities seemed like the behavior of someone who truly was becoming paranoid or obsessive. But as patterns emerged over weeks of careful record-keeping, the value of this approach became undeniable. I could see the systematic nature of what was happening in ways that individual incidents had obscured. What felt like isolated misunderstandings revealed themselves as coordinated manipulation when viewed chronologically. The challenge wasn't just remembering what happened. It was maintaining my own version of reality in the face of constant gaslighting about my memory and perceptions, like a scientist maintaining careful lab notes while someone else keeps changing the results. I had to trust my observations despite persistent suggestions that my recall was unreliable. Each entry in my notebook became an act of resistance against the narrative that my mind was deteriorating. My daughter's strategy relied on my inability to track patterns or remember specifics. She counted on the assumption that an elderly woman's memory would be naturally suspect, that small discrepancies would be attributed to normal aging rather than deliberate distortion. By maintaining systematic records, I removed her ability to rely on my supposed forgetfulness or confusion. I recorded the dates of real estate showings I hadn't authorized, the names of agents who had toured my home, and the conversations I had overheard about my supposed incapacity. Each unauthorized showing was noted with precise details about timing, participants, and the specific rooms that were examined. I tracked which agent took photographs, what questions they asked about the property, and how long they stayed. This information proved that these weren't casual visits or exploratory conversations, but systematic evaluation of my home as a marketable asset. The names and contact information of real estate professionals became particularly important evidence. My daughter had presented these visits as preliminary consultations to help me understand my options, but the agent's behavior and expertise suggested active preparation for an imminent sale. They measured rooms, evaluated structural conditions, and discussed market timing with the thoroughness of people working toward a specific deadline. Financial records became particularly crucial as I discovered discrepancies in my accounts and expenses I hadn't approved, all justified under the umbrella of helping me manage my affairs. I began photographing bank statements before my daughter filed them away, copying receipts for purchases I hadn't made, and noting withdrawals I hadn't authorized. The financial evidence revealed a pattern of steadily increasing control over my assets, with each transaction justified as necessary for my care or protection. New charges appeared regularly for services I hadn't requested, security systems I hadn't wanted, and medical consultations I hadn't agreed to. These expenses were presented as routine maintenance of my well-being, but my records showed they were actually infrastructure for increased surveillance and control. Each photograph of a financial statement became evidence that my competence to manage my own affairs was being systematically undermined, while I was simultaneously being charged for the services used to replace my autonomy. I photographed changes to my home, copied important papers before they could be removed or altered, and kept detailed records of my daily activities to counter claims about my declining capabilities. New locks, security cameras, and monitoring devices were installed and captured in my records before I could be told they were necessary for my safety. Legal papers were photographed before they disappeared into my daughter's filing system. Medical forms were copied before they were submitted to providers I had never chosen. The most crucial evidence involved recording my daughter's own words, the things she said when she thought I wasn't listening or wouldn't remember. Her phone conversations became particularly revealing when I began writing down exact quotes. The clinical language she used when discussing my condition contrasted sharply with the loving concern she expressed directly to me. The timeline she discussed with others was far more aggressive than anything she had mentioned in our conversations. These recorded conversations revealed that she had been maintaining two completely different narratives about my situation. To me, she presented gradual assistance and increasing support. To others, she described rapidly declining capabilities and urgent need for intervention. The discrepancy between these versions became clear only through careful tracking of what was actually said, rather than relying on my general impressions of our interactions. This process of systematic record-keeping restored my confidence in my own perceptions and gave me concrete evidence to counter the narrative of incompetence being constructed around me. Like an archaeologist carefully excavating artifacts that prove the existence of a lost civilization, I was preserving evidence of my own competence in the face of efforts to erase it. I discovered that strategic thinking becomes more powerful than emotional reactions when you have solid evidence to support your perspective and protect your interests. This careful record became my insurance policy and my proof that despite my age, my mind remained sharp and my observations remained accurate. But all the evidence in the world means nothing if you never find the courage to use it. That courage would be tested sooner than I expected, in a moment that would force me to choose between the safety of silence and the risk of standing up for myself. The phone call I overheard that Tuesday afternoon shattered any remaining illusions about my daughter's intentions. There comes a moment in every power struggle when the person being controlled decides they would rather face the consequences of resistance than continue living with the cost of compliance. Like a woman who finally realizes that staying in a burning building is more dangerous than jumping from the window, I reached the point where the risk of action became less terrifying than the certainty of inaction. My breaking point came not during a dramatic confrontation, but during a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I overheard my daughter scheduling another showing for that weekend. Her voice carried the same professional efficiency I had heard before, but this time I caught details that made my blood run cold. She wasn't just scheduling a tour. She was confirming arrangements that assumed decisions had already been made, agreements had already been reached, and my cooperation was guaranteed. The conversation revealed a timeline I had never been consulted about, and commitments I had never authorized. She spoke about clearing out personal items by a specific date, about having utilities transferred, about coordinating the moving company she had apparently already contacted. Each detail hit me like evidence of a crime I was only now discovering had been committed against me. She was discussing my home as if it were already sold, making commitments about possession dates and move-out timelines that assumed my complete cooperation with plans I had never agreed to. The buyer, she explained, needed occupancy by the 1st of June because they had already given notice on their current rental. The closing date had been tentatively set based on how quickly the competency evaluation could be completed and the legal paperwork processed. The words froze me in my chair. Competency evaluation. Legal paperwork. These weren't discussions about helping me plan for my future. These were arrangements for removing my ability to have a future of my own choosing. The clinical language revealed that I wasn't a participant in these decisions. I was an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved through proper legal channels. The conversation revealed the full scope of her strategy, not just selling my home, but having me declared incompetent to manage my affairs, with her as the appointed guardian of my estate. She had already consulted with attorneys about the process, already scheduled appointments with medical professionals who would conduct the evaluation, already prepared documentation that would support her petition for guardianship. This wasn't a contingency plan. This was an active strategy nearing completion. Her tone when discussing the competency evaluation was particularly chilling. She described it as a formality, something that would be easily accomplished given the evidence she had been collecting about my declining capabilities, the doctor's appointments she had scheduled, the medications she had been managing, the social isolation she had engineered. All of it had been building toward this moment when professional evaluation would confirm what she had been systematically creating. In that moment, I understood that my compliance had been interpreted as consent, and my silence had been taken as agreement with arrangements that would strip me of every remaining piece of autonomy. Every time I had cooperated with her suggestions, every time I had accepted her help without protest, every time I had allowed her to make decisions on my behalf, I had been unknowingly participating in the construction of the legal case that would be used to remove my rights entirely. My passivity had become her evidence. My gratitude had become proof of my dependence. My trust had become the foundation for my own disenfranchisement. Like someone who signs documents without reading them, only to discover they have agreed to terms that benefit everyone except themselves. I had been cooperating with my own elimination. The fear that had kept me passive suddenly transformed into something harder and more focused, a determination that surprised me with its intensity and clarity. The emotion wasn't anger, though anger would have been justified. It wasn't hurt, though the betrayal cut deep. It was something colder and more calculating, a recognition that I was facing an opponent who had been planning while I had been trusting. This wasn't my daughter acting out of misguided concern anymore. This was someone who had developed expertise in elder law, researched medical procedures for competency evaluation, and cultivated professional relationships that would support her objectives. She had become strategic while I had remained sentimental. She had been thinking tactically while I had been thinking emotionally. I realized that the worst-case scenario wasn't the conflict that would come from resistance. It was the life that awaited me if I continued to cooperate with my own erasure. The future she was arranging for me involved complete loss of autonomy, total dependence on her decisions, and legal inability to advocate for my own interests. Resistance might create drama, but compliance would create captivity. This shift from victim to strategic opponent happened not through anger, but through a cold calculation of what I had left to lose versus what I still had the power to protect. Like a general who finally understands the true nature of the battle being fought, I began to see my situation in terms of strategy rather than emotion, tactics rather than feelings. I learned that the difference between being a victim and becoming a survivor often comes down to a single moment of choosing calculated risk over certain loss. What I needed now wasn't dramatic confrontation or emotional appeals. I needed to become as methodical and strategic as she had been, but in service of my own liberation, rather than my captivity. My first move was to establish a legal consultation during her weekly grocery shopping trips, using the brief window of guaranteed solitude to understand my rights and options. True power moves are often invisible to the person you're moving against, which is why my most effective strategies looked like ordinary daily activities. Like a chess player who appears to be making random moves while actually setting up a complex trap, I began operating on multiple levels simultaneously. My daughter saw an elderly woman going through her normal routines. What she couldn't see was the systematic dismantling of every control mechanism she had so carefully constructed around my life. Instead of confronting my daughter directly, I began systematically undoing the isolation and dependence she had so carefully constructed around me. Direct confrontation would have been satisfying emotionally, but strategically disastrous. It would have revealed my awareness of her plans and given her the opportunity to accelerate her timeline or implement more restrictive measures. The element of surprise was my greatest advantage, and I intended to preserve it until I was ready to use it decisively. The strategy required patience I didn't know I possessed. Each action had to appear completely natural while serving a larger purpose she couldn't detect. Like a gardener who secretly replants a garden while the original landscaper isn't watching, I had to restore what had been removed without leaving evidence of my intentions. Every action had to be calculated to avoid triggering an escalation that would result in immediate retaliation or acceleration of her timeline. I understood that my daughter was operating according to a carefully planned schedule. Any sudden change in my behavior or unexpected resistance to her arrangements might cause her to move more quickly toward the competency evaluation she had already arranged. My window of opportunity was narrow, and premature discovery would close it permanently. Those Thursday afternoons when she left to shop for both our households gave me exactly 90 minutes of guaranteed solitude. I used that time to make the most important phone call of my adult life. The attorney's office was initially skeptical. Adult children calling about elderly parents who needed protection were common. Elderly parents calling about adult children who were overstepping boundaries were much less frequent. But my documentation and the specific details I could provide about unauthorized real estate activities convinced them this was a legitimate case requiring immediate attention. Legal protection required swift action on multiple fronts. Powers of attorney that I had never signed needed to be formally revoked. Authorizations I had never given needed to be legally canceled. Most importantly, I needed to establish a clear paper trail proving my continued competence and decision-making capacity before any evaluation could be scheduled or completed. Financial accounts that had been simplified under her management were quietly restored to my sole control. One conversation with bank managers who were surprised to learn I had been excluded from my own affairs. The meetings revealed the extent of changes that had been made without my knowledge or consent. Automatic payments had been established for services I hadn't requested. Account access had been restricted based on concerns about my cognitive abilities that I had never expressed. Each financial institution required different procedures for restoration of full account control. Some needed letters from my attorney confirming my competence. Others required in-person visits with multiple forms of identification. All of them needed documentation proving that previous changes had been made without proper authorization. The process was complex but necessary to prevent my daughter from accessing funds she might use to accelerate her plans. The real estate situation required the most delicate handling. I contacted agents directly to revoke any authorizations and make it clear that no sale was authorized or desired. These conversations were more difficult than I had anticipated. Several agents revealed that preliminary agreements had been signed using documentation I had never seen. Marketing materials were already being prepared, showing schedules were already being coordinated with potential buyers. Canceling these arrangements required legal intervention and formal notification that any previous agreements were unauthorized and invalid. The agents were professional, but clearly frustrated by the complications this created for their business relationships and marketing timelines. Some had already invested significant time and resources based on assurances they had received about the certainty of the sale. Key relationships with neighbors and old friends were reestablished through careful phone calls and casual encounters that rebuilt my support network without triggering her suspicion. Like a spy activating dormant assets, I began reaching out to people whose connection to my life had been systematically severed. Each conversation revealed how thoroughly my isolation had been engineered and how willing people were to reconnect once they understood that contact was welcomed rather than burdensome. The most satisfying move was changing my locks and having new keys made. Not to lock her out, but to ensure that I controlled access to my own space. The locksmith who installed the new system was the same one who had done the previous installations at my daughter's request. His surprise at my independent contact was evident, but professional ethics prevented him from questioning my right to secure my own property according to my own preferences. I discovered that small, deliberate acts of defiance can pave the way for broader liberation when they're executed with patience and strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. Each quiet victory rebuilt my confidence and expanded my sense of what was possible, proving to myself that my capacity for self-determination had never actually disappeared. It had simply been buried under months of systematic discouragement and manufactured dependence. The foundation was now in place. All that remained was for my daughter to discover what I had been quietly accomplishing while she believed I remained under her control. The doorbell rang at exactly 10:30 on Tuesday morning, just as it had for months. But this time, my daughter's key wouldn't turn in the familiar lock. She had to knock on the door of the home she had been treating as her own property. When I opened it, she saw immediately that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power between us. She stood in my doorway for a moment, processing the implications of what had just occurred. Her expression moved through several stages of recognition. First came confusion as she tried to understand why her key hadn't worked. Then came the dawning awareness that this change had been deliberate. Finally came the calculation as she assessed what this might mean for her carefully laid plans. The moment she realized that I had reclaimed control of my own lifeway, as written across her face, surprise, then anger, then a calculating assessment of her remaining options. She was looking at someone she no longer recognized. Someone who had been playing by different rules while she thought the game was still proceeding according to her design. I gestured for her to sit in the chair across from my coffee table where I had arranged my materials. The folder between us contained copies of every piece of evidence I had gathered about her unauthorized activities, bank statements showing transactions I hadn't approved, real estate documents bearing signatures I had never provided, medical forms completed without my knowledge or consent. I presented her with copies of all the documentation I had gathered, the legal consultations I had completed, and the authorizations I had revoked, speaking in the same businesslike tone she had used when discussing my future. My voice carried the same professional detachment she had employed during her phone calls about my condition. Each document was presented with calm explanation of what it proved and what actions I had taken to correct the unauthorized arrangements. The real estate agreements were particularly damaging to her position. I had documentation proving that showings had been scheduled without my consent, that agents had been given access to my property without my authorization, and that preliminary sales arrangements had been discussed using my supposed incapacity as justification for bypassing my involvement in decisions about my own home. Her attempts to reframe the conversation around my safety and well-being fell flat against the evidence of her unauthorized actions and the clear demonstration of my continued competence. Every familiar argument about my declining abilities was countered with specific examples of strategic thinking and detailed planning. Every expression of concern about my welfare was matched with evidence of activities that had been conducted without my knowledge or permission. She tried to explain that everything had been done out of love, that her interventions were necessary because I couldn't see how much help I needed. But the documentation made it clear that her assessment of my needs had been shaped by her own financial interests, rather than genuine concern for my well-being. The timeline of her involvement corresponded exactly with her own personal financial pressures, not with any decline in my capabilities. The conversation revealed that she had genuinely convinced herself that her control was necessary and beneficial, which made her resistance to my independence even more determined. In her mind, she had been sacrificing her own time and energy to manage problems I was too confused to recognize. My resistance to her help was further evidence of the cognitive decline she had been documenting and reporting to medical professionals. This conviction made her more dangerous than someone who was consciously manipulating the situation for personal gain. She believed her own narrative about my incapacity so completely that any evidence to the contrary was interpreted as temporary improvement or clever manipulation on my part. My strategic planning wasn't proof of continued competence, but evidence of cunning that made her oversight even more necessary. We both understood that our relationship had fundamentally changed. I was no longer someone who could be managed, and she was no longer someone I could trust with unlimited access to my life. The roles we had been playing for months were permanently altered. The loving daughter and grateful mother had been replaced by two adults with conflicting interests and incompatible goals. The new boundaries I established were non-negotiable. My home, my finances, and my daily decisions would remain under my control, with her involvement limited to what I explicitly requested. She would no longer have keys to my property, access to my accounts, or authority to make decisions on my behalf. The elaborate system of control she had constructed was being dismantled completely. Her involvement in my life would be redefined according to my terms, rather than her assessment of my needs. Visits would happen when I invited them. Assistance would be provided when I requested it. Medical appointments would be scheduled according to my preferences with doctors I chose myself. The infrastructure of monitoring and management she had built around my daily existence was being removed entirely. This conversation marked the end of her control and the beginning of a new relationship built on respect for my autonomy, rather than assumptions about my incapacity. What I learned from this experience extends far beyond my own situation, because the strategies that worked for me are available to any woman who finds herself in similar circumstances. The tools that saved my life are within reach of anyone who chooses to use them. Your life belongs to you and no one else, regardless of your age, your limitations, or how much someone claims to love you. When family members begin treating your independence as their inconvenience, remember that love never requires the surrender of your autonomy. The 3 strategic moves that transformed my situation, gaining knowledge, building external support, and taking calculated action, are available to any woman facing similar betrayal. Documentation becomes your evidence. Reconnection becomes your lifeline. Strategic thinking becomes your weapon against those who underestimate your capabilities. Remember that wisdom and strategic thinking are not diminished by age, and your capacity for self-determination remains intact as long as you choose to exercise it.